Hey, good morning. My name is Katie Merrill, and I'm excited to welcome you on this Sunday morning, the first one in October, and it's really turning into fall. As you can see, we're still doing our platforms virtually, but when the time is right, we will resume in-person gatherings at our building in Skokie. Before we get started, we usually provide a quote or other information to give folks a sense of what the Ethical Society is all about. Today, I'm going to share our value statement, which is displayed with our vision and mission statements on our website. So here it goes. We value the importance of living an ethical, responsible, and joyful life. We promote intellectual, philosophical, and artistic freedom, avoiding dogma and rigid creed. We nurture a sense of wonder about life, nature, and the universe, and are inspired by positive models of human achievement. Shaped by the forces of humanism, democracy, science, and religious reform, we cherish human diversity, and we focus on what we have in common, not on what keeps us apart. So that's a teeny thing about us. For those of you who are new to this online Sunday platform format, we just want to let you know there's a chance to submit questions after the presentation through the YouTube comment section that you can see on the right of your, usually on the right of your screen. But before we get to that, we'll hear from our speaker, and then we'll have a brief musical interlude, and then we'll get to your questions. So today, their speaker is Siegel, who's going to explain to us the terrifying consequences of doing our own research. Our programs address a wide variety of topics, including current events, philosophy, arts, and sciences, to name just a few. Today's presentation is part of our ongoing programming related to science. Siegel is an astrophysicist, author, and science communicator. He is a science contributor at Forbes and started the popular blog called Starts with a Bang. He also hosts a podcast of the same name. He is a frequent speaker on astrophysics and cosmology, and his two books are Technology, The Science of Star Trek from Tricorders to Warp Drive and Beyond. And I'm sorry, I'm going to start all over that. Technology, The Science of Star Trek from Tricorders to Warp Drive, and Beyond the Galaxy, How Humanity Looked Beyond Our Milky Way and Discovered the Entire Universe. He often comments about science on local TV and is on Twitter at Starts with a Bang. It's my pleasure to welcome Ethan to join us this morning.
All right. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And it's wonderful to know you're all out there watching. Welcome to the Ethical Humanist Society of Chicago. It's my pleasure to be here. And I'm Siegel. So I'm here today to talk to you not about astrophysics, which is my specialty, but another specialty I have. I've been doing science communication for about 12 years. I started Starts with a Bang, my website, back in 2008. And one of the things I've been really trying very hard to do is to separate for people what we actually know as like what's established scientifically valid knowledge that we should all be using, and what's speculative, what's at the frontiers, what are we still highly uncertain about, where do we lack scientific consensus. And I want to talk to you a little bit more about that today with this little bit of an inflammatory titled talk, The Terrifying Consequences of Doing Our Own Research. Because most of you, I think, when you hear this, you're kind of two minds of it. One is you're probably saying like, okay, well, I'm not an expert in everything. I don't really do my own research. Like when I actually when I talk to a doctor, I'm looking up information about my health, but I'm not the expert on the human body, anatomy, physiology, biochemical pathways, etc. The doctor and the healthcare professionals is. But other times you think, I can do it. I can learn how to do anything. I'm capable of doing my own research. Why would you say the terrifying consequences of doing our own research? So let's dive into this, because this is something that I think we've heard a lot, especially this year, about, well, I've done my own research and I encourage you to do your own research. So let's look into this, right? Isn't research good? Well, let's see if we can get on the same page and talk about what good research is, and maybe even just what research is first, right? Because there's two kinds of research, aren't there? There's this scientific research of, okay, I'm going to push the frontiers of what we know. I'm going to examine things from the physical sciences or the life sciences that haven't been examined before or haven't been sufficiently examined before. And that's one kind of research. On the other hand, we use this word research very informally, the same way we use the word theory, very different than a scientist uses the word theory, right? We have the one hand of research where, okay, these are scientists working within what's already known and working to extend our knowledge, working to research novel vaccine pathways, working to research the mysteries of particle physics and the fundamental nature of the fundamental particles in our universe. We have astrophysics research, we have biophysical research, health research, medicine research, chemistry research. We have all of these like cutting edge field. And on the other hand, we say like, do your own research and listen to Kevin Trudeau, who's going to sell you coral calcium. And by the way, you might die of lead poisoning or arsenic poisoning because this is not really valid and it's just a shill operation and Kevin Trudeau's in jail. Joe Mercola and Dr. Oz are not in jail. Ralph Wiggum is not maybe your best example of a researcher, but I don't think that's what we should do. I don't think we should look at it as, okay, which category do I fall into? And I know what I'm doing. And I know how to do real research versus how to separate fact from fiction, right? We all run the risk of falling prey to misinformation if the misinformation is something we encounter and we believe it, or worse, want to believe it. So doing actual research is incredibly valuable, right? When you think about what scientific research has given to us, as we look around at our modern society, our modern civilization, actual research has, that's science, the body of knowledge of everything we've learned throughout human history. That is everything we figured out how to apply science to, all of these technologies that we have that allow me to speak to you from the West Coast of the United States in real time, and from anywhere in the world, you can hear me, see me, and listen to this presentation. And there's not even a delay. It's not even like, oh, we got to send this signal up to space and it's got to come back down and we're waiting like Nixon on the phone with the Apollo astronauts. No, doing actual research is incredibly valuable. The thing that I want to emphasize is that most people, even people who actually perform research in some aspect of their lives, most people are neither aware of nor do they appreciate what research actually entails. So let's look at this. I want you to remember those phrases: being aware of and appreciating research, and scientific research in particular. So if I ask, what is research, right? Research, for lack of a better term, research is saying, okay, look, we know a certain amount of stuff. We think we know this because we've got this cumulative body of evidence, and we have this scientific process by which we try and make sense of this world. What we do is we say, okay, here's this great body of knowledge, all these facts, all these experimental results, all these measurements we've made, all these observations we've taken of the universe from all throughout human history, everything that's ever been rigorously recorded and tested, controlled experiments, uncontrolled observational studies. We've got all of these different bodies of knowledge. When we put them all together, and then we start saying, okay, we're going to make sense of this, right? We're going to try and make scientific sense of this. We're going to have a scientific theory that's going to try and explain these phenomena. And the scientific theory is going to have a range of validity, and over which all of this stuff agrees. And then there'll be this range of validity where we're questionable about it. Like, okay, we know things break down here, or we don't know how to measure things here, or we're outside of our area of expertise here. Research is an attempt to perform novel scientific investigation into a scientific matter, right? A scientific matter is something that can be decided by observations, by measurements, by something that asks reality in some form questions about itself. When you're doing research, whether it's theoretical, experimental, simulations, all of that, research is a novel scientific investigation into a scientific matter. And there are all sorts of examples of what research is. Sometimes you go back to the basics and you say, there were these scientific studies that were done, and I want to do them more rigorously. I want a greater sample size. I want to reproduce something that's already been done. I want to probe it at different energies or under different conditions that have been done before. You can replicate existing scientific studies with greater rigor in some fashion. You can say, okay, well, we have this current understanding, and I want to extend that understanding, or I want to confirm or refute whether this understanding is valid under these variety of controlled conditions. Or I could just perform some other test that probes our current understanding. For example, we're always looking for new ways to test general relativity. We're always looking for new ways to test the standard model of particle physics, right? If there are cracks in our understanding, we believe that we don't know everything there is to know about our universe. Every time we test our current understanding, we try and push beyond our current understanding, we attempt to look for new or novel effects, or we find an effect we didn't expect and we try to account for it. That's research. And there are some aspects of research that I think maybe should be emphasized that aren't obvious, or at least they aren't generally appreciated. So here are some things that research is that most people don't know or appreciate. Research always begins from the existing scientific consensus. The existing scientific consensus is not okay, like, well, most scientists think this thing and scientists are often wrong. That is not what I want you to think of. If you have that notion in your head, I want you to challenge that. Research always begins from the existing scientific consensus. Is that consensus always right? No. But what that consensus is that's the starting point. That says when we look at the preponderance of evidence out there, the full suite of all the evidence relevant to a particular problem, the scientific consensus is the position where the overwhelming majority of active scientists working in this field today accept this is a good explanation. This is a good framework for working within to understanding what's going on. If that scientific consensus is wrong, it's going to be wrong in a subtle way that's fooled most of the professionals in the field. When you do research, you always assume a certain foundation of knowledge before beginning. You don't have to rederive what a number is to start doing research, right? You don't have to define that, like counting marbles of different colors. You don't have to like go and mathematically prove that numbers exist and you can do this. You can assume a foundation of knowledge, right? In physics, we don't go back to pre-Newtonian physics with every scientific paper and say, okay, we're going to derive Newton and we're going to derive Einstein, we're going to derive Bohr and Dirac and Feynman. And no, we don't do that. We say we have a foundation of knowledge and we start here. And this is the foundation of knowledge that everyone who became a professional in this, who went through all that training and hard work and unlearning the difficult ideas that they needed to unlearn in order to get to that point, we assume that foundation. That foundation is what the scientific consensus is. The scientific consensus is the default position that we either work to build on, we work to test, we work to extend, or we attempt to refute or poke holes in. That's that foundation. People who reject a scientific consensus and choose a different starting point, an alternative starting point, that often fails to pass scientific muster either because they're ignoring a large part of that suite of evidence that we have, where they're cherry picking, like, well, if I look at this part and this part, but not these parts, then I can put together an alternative explanation. Or worse, it's because they're engaging in what we call motivated reasoning, where they have a preferred conclusion already picked out that, okay, it's not really scientifically tenable, but they're trying to promote an alternative agenda. Research always begins from the existing scientific consensus. Even if it's an attempt to refute that scientific consensus, you have to assume that what the consensus is the default starting point that people are coming from, people with expertise are coming from. Here's some examples of what isn't research. First, looking up the information you can find, especially if you yourself are not an expert. You're only going to look up the information that's easily accessible or findable by you. One of the things that I've learned how to do, and I'm very fortunate that I have a network of scientists that I trust at my disposal, is I have access to experts in all sorts of different scientific fields who understand the importance of knowing the scientific consensus, of listening to the scientific consensus, and of using that as your starting point. You can always find an expert, sometimes an expert, but often an actual expert, a bona fide expert who's a professional in the field. You can find an expert who says something, who says X, even if they themselves don't have the expertise to evaluate the background for X, or if the expert doesn't have it. The problem is, when you find an expert who says something, if you yourself don't have the intellectual background, the educational background, if you don't understand the landscape of that field and what that expert is saying in the context of what's understood about that field, you're not going to draw the right conclusions. You can't be expected to. Certainly, you can't reliably expect to draw those conclusions. We are not doing research when we are non-experts analyzing information without the relevant knowledge background. That's why it's so important to understand and to find who are the actual field of experts surrounding this issue. What is the consensus position? What is where that range of validity, where we're confident this scientific consensus applies, where does that range extend to and where does it end? What takes us from the realm of what we confidently know versus what's speculative? Even many scientists are not good at drawing or delineating those lines. There are a lot of very smart, very popular scientists who will mix their own speculations with the actual facts. And part of our job as the educated, ethical public is to try and separate out what do we actually know from what don't we know yet, right? So here's a nice example, right? Up at the top, you can see a graph. This was constructed in early June of 2020, and this was the number of coronavirus cases in the United States. And you can see over on the right of that line, right, there's the line of like, here's the data. And then like you can see the dotted line is an average of like, okay, we're doing a running average where we average over weekly variations, we average over spikes and dips. And now when we project into the future, here's what, the black dotted line is one model, the red dotted line is another model. And then that red shaded area, that's the uncertainty that they projected onto, like, okay, and really things could fall anywhere within that range. But then if we take a look at the blue lines down at the bottom, you can see, well, here's what actually happened. Here's the data that actually we obtained. Here's the number of actual COVID cases in the United States. And you can see that these models, they were all wrong because none of them accounted for the actual behavior of Americans, and none of them accounted for the actual regulations or lack of regulations that would be put into place. Or the amount of misinformation that was out there that contributed to the spread of COVID. So it's very important to say what are the uncertainties here and to be honest about them. Because if we are using what models said versus what the data said, you have to constantly revise what were your assumptions. You have to constantly question them, particularly when the data stops matching up with what your predictions were. This is very important because I want to highlight this difference between expertise and the research that experts do versus what you might infer from looking at this, even if you're very educated, but you're not an expert in the field and you don't understand what's speculative, right? We wanted these models to be accurate. We wanted these models to be true, but they didn't come in because they didn't take into account all of the variables. And even today, these models are not doing a good job because they're not taking into account all of the effects that are actually at play. So I want to reframe this a little differently with the electrician question. If you put into Google, like wiring your own house, right? You can see all sorts of success stories about people who've wired their own house, right? You can do it. There are tutorials. You can find the equipment. You can do it yourself. And many people do. Many people wire their own houses, right? Or you can call a professional. You can call an electrician and have the electrician wire your house. Now, both of these are perfectly fine, but one of these paths leads to a much greater risk of a catastrophic electrical fire, and that is the wiring your own house path. And that's not to say you can't wire your own house. That isn't even to say you shouldn't wire your own house. But people who do wire their own house are far more likely to have their house burned down in an electrical fire. Why? Why is this? Well, let's look at it this way. Expertise matters, right? It doesn't mean that the expert is always right. Experts make mistakes too. Experts think about things that they understood that the current understanding was when they learned it, and they don't always keep up on changes to that. We are constantly gaining new knowledge. Expertise is constantly morphing. The scientific consensus often expands or morphs a little bit, or something that we thought was going to be true, we actually have an anomaly there and we need to explain it, right? It definitely doesn't mean that the expert has all the answers. If you've ever gone to the doctor and say, hey, doctor, I have this physical problem. What do you think is going on? They don't always know. Sometimes they'll even tell you what they think is going on and it won't be right. Experts aren't always right. They don't always understand everything that's going on. But it also doesn't mean that the current scientific consensus will be good if they give you an answer that's in line with the current scientific consensus. It doesn't mean this will be good for all time, always and forever. It doesn't mean that current understanding won't someday be superseded by a better one. But I want you to focus on this point. The below average electrician, for example, knows much, much more about wiring a house, about safety, about all the conditions they're going to encounter with your house than the vastly above average handyman homeowner. This applies to all experts. A below average expert knows much, much more about their area of expertise than the vastly above average layperson, than the vastly above average educated amateur in this. And I don't think this is something we value very much in our society. We have this sort of rugged individualist attitude that causes us to overvalue what we think we know and to undervalue what other people actually legitimately know. let me give you a pretty, actually surprisingly controversial example, but one that most people don't even think about, particularly here in the United States, and that's fluoride or fluoridated drinking water. So cheers to that. Now, if you go to most cities in the United States, most municipalities, most places that have municipal drinking water, where you're not getting your drinking water from a well dug in your own yard, but you're getting water from a water supply. Most people living in the United States have access to fluoridated drinking water. In some places, like in Colorado, they will remove fluoride from the drinking water to put it into a certain range. And in other places, in most places, they'll add fluoride to the drinking water. Fluoride is an ion. It can be bound up in natural, like sodium fluoride or calcium fluoride, or in most cases, one man's trash is another man's treasure. It's actually there's this ion, this compound, like a salt, that they add into the water. That's actually an industrial waste product, but it's perfectly fine to use in the desired quantities, in the right quantities, to raise the level of fluoride in the drinking water. They started a national program to do this, and most cities do it. When I say a national program, it was recommended by experts and it went through all the rigorous studies. And what they found on average is that if you fluoridate drinking water at this correct level, at this recommended level, children grow healthier bones, healthier teeth, stronger enamel, that fluoride can help you remineralize your enamel, and that on average, across the entire population, children in particular get about 40% fewer cavities over their childhood if their drinking water is fluoridated versus if their drinking water is unfluoridated. However, I had the pleasure of living in Portland, Oregon, during a time where a fluoridation measure was on the ballot. And I learned to my horror that Portland, Oregon was the largest city in the United States where fluoridated water is not a thing, where all the water has no fluoride added to it, and the fluoridation levels naturally are far below the recommended levels. So why is this? Well, you don't have to watch Dr. Strangelove to know that what's going on is there is this idea out there that fluoride is poison, that fluoride is a toxin and it can have these deleterious effects on the human body. And if you have too much of it, it can be a disaster. And if you go to do your own research, you can find all sorts of information worrying about what does fluoride do to you. You can read about the woman who drank green tea and gave herself fluoride poisoning. You can read and skeletal fluorosis, where her skeleton became deformed. You can look at these scary pictures I've got here at the upper left of teeth, and you could see normal teeth or only mild fluorosis, but then you could see this pitting and this brown stuff from overfluoridation, and oh, how scary this is. And you can see the big headline on the right from one of my favorite internet psychopaths, Dr. Joseph Mercola, who says Harvard study confirms fluoride reduces children's IQ. Oh no, are our children having their minds poisoned from this? You can find that, oh no, fluoride helps with the uptake of calcium, which might be good for your bones, but it calcifies your pineal gland. And you say, well, what does that do? Well, and apparently there are all of these informational sources that you can find out there that talk about how a calcified pineal gland will stop you from being able to astral project. Like, everybody was astral projecting before the 1940s, and we added fluoride to the drinking water, and then all of a sudden they stopped. So quick, everybody, talk to your grandparents or great grandparents real fast so you can find out about their astral projection experiences before their pineal gland got calcified. But it turns out none of that is actually true. Yeah, your pineal gland does get calcified because fluoride helps with the uptake of calcium, but that's actually good for your bones. It's good for your teeth. It's good for your enamel. Those fluoride studies, those you only see reduced IQ when you've ingested enough fluoride to poison yourself. The person who's known as the father of modern toxicology. His name, he's known as Paracelsus. And for those of you who are Full Metal Alchemist fans, the character von Hohenheim is actually his real name, Theophrastus Bombastus, blah, 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 von Hohenheim. That is Paracelsus, the father of modern toxicology. And more than 500 years ago, he said something that was just profound about how all things are poison in large enough doses, right? That what differentiates the medicine from the cure is the dose. And this is true when it comes to fluoride, right? So the way you find the way out, you don't go to the journal Fluoride, by the way. There's a journal called Fluoride that is all about these fluoride conspiracies, where they don't tell you that the woman who gave herself skeletal fluorosis from drinking green tea is that green tea naturally contains a significant amount of fluoride. Having a cup or 2 cups or 5 cups a day of green tea won't do it. This woman made a pitcher of green tea every day using 66 tea bags per pitcher of green tea, and she gave herself fluoride poisoning. There is no way that fluoridated drinking water contributes to that. This systematic review, right? This is one of the things that scientists know to look for, is to say, oh, we'll look at the literature review. We'll look at, when you look at all the scientific literature and analyze it responsibly, what do you find? And I made a pretty unprofessional chart summarizing these findings, right? In yellow, we're going to talk about bad stuff that happens to your teeth and your bones dependent on the fluoride concentration, right? So what you can see is if you're getting no fluoride ions in your body means you don't have this necessary ion to help your body uptake calcium, to help your body put the right minerals in your teeth, in your bones, in your enamel. So there is, this rough scientific curve that too little is bad, too much is bad, but there's this right amount. I think what the scientific evidence shows is the best right amount is slightly less than what the CDC recommends, but the CDC's recommendations are close. Where you have this incidence of bad stuff that happens, but if you fluoridate your water at the CDC recommended level, you will find that kids on average have better public health outcomes, fewer cavities, fewer bone fractures if their drinking water is fluoridated. And you could say like, okay, well, maybe that industrial fluoride, we can move away from that and put those natural sodium fluoride or calcium fluoride in there instead. And you can, but it's 5 times more expensive to do it. So if you have a municipality that's willing to do it, they should take that public health measure. But most of that stuff that's out there about what's the bad stuff that happens, it's that red stuff: hip fractures, dental fluorosis, skeletal fluorosis, lowered IQ. That stuff does not happen in excess at the CDC recommended level. At the level that we say, here's how you should be fluoridating your drinking water, we don't have those excess things. Only when you go way past the recommended level, past even the legal limit, do you start seeing hip fractures, dental fluorosis, skeletal fluorosis, lowered IQ. this bad stuff happens at extremely high dose. It's the dose that makes the poison. If you care about public health, about dental health, about children, particularly in low income brackets, being pain-free in school, when kids don't have head pain because they don't have untreated cavities, you would advocate for fluoridated drinking water. Dental professionals recommend it, the ADA recommends it, the CDC recommends it, but we don't have a law that mandates it, and public fear about it and public ideology where natural is better can lead to these problems where if you compare kids of the same demographics in Portland versus the same demographics in Seattle, you see that the Seattle kids systematically 40% fewer cavities. In Calgary, Alberta, the city council voted against the will of the people, by the way, to remove fluoride for the drinking water, and there are still attempts to put it back that haven't failed, and Calgary is having the same effects of higher dental cavity rates, particularly in low-income children, over the rest of comparable cities in Canada. Well, it's not just fluoride. What about vaccines? Again, same thing. You can go to the doctors, you can go to the experts, and you can find people who will tell you about the dangers of vaccines. Some people will still bring up old debunked studies about vaccines causing autism. Other people will bring up anecdotes about how people have reported, well, my kid got this vaccination, and then 24 to 48 hours later, or within 48 hours, they had this adverse reaction. Well, what are those adverse reactions? Well, a lot of them have arm pain or swelling in the injection site. That's a normal expected one. But then there are all sorts of claims that come in about my kid got spontaneously sick and had this illness and wound up with this disability. Those things happen. The thing is, when you look at statistically, when does that happen? Who does this happen to? When does it happen relative to vaccines? It is completely statistically consistent with all of this being random chance. The vaccine schedule and the incidence of adverse effects, it's not statistically significant that kids get more of an effect after it. Kids get sick. Diseases present at specific times in childhood development, and illnesses just happen. In fact, one of the great places where illnesses are transmitted is a doctor's office, is hospital settings. We've learned this very clearly this year, that medical settings are excellent places for diseases and illnesses to be transmitted, unfortunately. At one point, during maybe the height of the autism vaccines fiasco, I asked a doctor, a medical professional, but a physician, about what he thought about vaccines. And he was very informed. He gave me sort of this long speech about what was known about vaccines, what was in vaccines, vaccine ingredients, vaccine effects, what he was personally worried about, what he thought, he was speculating about beyond the scientific consensus, what could be out there, what could be causing difficulties. He wasn't worried about mercury because he understood that mercury isn't just an element. Mercury is bound up in different compounds. And there was a difference between methyl mercury and ethyl mercury, one of which is very toxic to humans and one of which is not absorbed by the human body at all. It simply passes right through it and is easily expelled. And one's in vaccines and one isn't. But what he said to me at the end was what stuck with me. He said to me, but you need to understand that what I'm giving you is my professional and personal opinion. You should not be listening to that because I am not a member of the CDC. In fact, he said, I'm not qualified to be a member of the CDC. I am a medical doctor, but my expertise is not in epidemiology and public health and disease ecology and how preventative medicine works. I'm a primary care physician. There are 3,000 people approximately who are experts in exactly this field about vaccines in the CDC who will make these public health recommendations. And I would be Dunning-Krugering myself. The doctor said this to me, that he would be Dunning-Krugering himself if he thought that he could tell a patient to follow his concerns or recommendations instead of the CDC's. And that's always stuck with me because it was for me a moment where someone who was much more of an expert than I was told me, don't listen to me, listen to the experts who have greater expertise than I do. And that's what I've tried to do in every scientific aspect of our lives since then. You can ask the same thing about climate change, right? You can find contrarian scientists who defy the scientific consensus, who talk about climate change and who talk about, maybe it's not caused by humans, maybe it's caused by the sun, maybe it's caused by volcanoes, right? You have all these different things. Well, you can look at sea levels and sea level rise, and you can see that not only have sea levels been rising a total of about 7 inches over the last 100 years in some places, by the way, but you can see that sea level rise has been accelerating. What about temperatures? You can look at the global average temperature year to year and see that the average global temperature over land and ocean has been rising and rising and rising and continues to rise along with CO2 concentration, right? This is an issue where a scientific consensus exists. You can find experts who say like, oh, I don't believe this, but the overwhelming majority of people working in this field have not only obtained and achieved this consensus has been around for decades. Well, what about the flat Earth? And for this one, sure, look at these pictures of Earth. Pictures are flat, Earth is flat, there you go. No, obviously not. We have all sorts of ways of knowing the Earth isn't flat. You can send a satellite probe to space and watch the Earth rotate beneath you. You can, in 1948, we've been going up to space from in the 1940s, starting with V2 rockets at White Sands Missile Base. We were high enough up into space that we could see the curvature of the Earth from photographs. Right? So for more than the lifetime of most people watching this talk, we've had direct photographic evidence. You can watch the shadows of the Earth on the moon during a lunar eclipse, and you can see oh, it's always round, and it's round no matter where you are on Earth, no matter what time of night the eclipse occurs at. The Earth always produces a circular shadow regardless of how it's oriented. And most importantly, this has been known for over 2,000 years. If you go to 2 locations on Earth that are at different latitudes, and you look at the shadows that are cast by a vertical stick when the sun is highest overhead, you will get different values for what that shadow is. This was performed allegedly or legendarily, I should say, by Eratosthenes, who was a Greek living in Egypt, and he lived in Alexandria. And he noted that on the solstice, right, where the sun came highest to getting directly overhead, it cast a shadow at Alexandria. A vertical stick cast a shadow that made an angle of 7.2 degrees. But he got a letter from someone living in Syene, Egypt, another 7 degrees further south or so, that said a stick casts no shadow at noon on the solstice. So then he did what any legitimate scientist would do, and he did this 2,000 years ago. He sent the equivalent of a grad student down to Syene to go measure this. And he found, indeed, there was no shadow there cast on the solstice while he saw that shadow of 7.2 degrees. Then he had the assistant walk via camel from Syene to Alexandria in an attempt to measure the distance there. So he not only went and said, hey, I know the Earth is curved, by measuring the distance and measuring that angle distance, he was able to say, hey, here's what the circumference of the Earth is. Not only do I know it's round, but here's its circumference. And that figure was right to within about 20%. Eratosthenes was our first geographer, the first one to realize that Earth had two polar regions, two temperate regions, and one hot zone around the equator. And when I say he was the first to realize this, I say he was the first to scientifically rationalize this, but it's actually written even earlier, way back in Herodotus, the first historian. Herodotus is talking about where's the source of the Nile coming from. And he gives an explanation that's wrong, but some people say this, and he gives another explanation that's wrong, and some people say this. And then he says, and some Egyptians say that further south there are these mountains that get ice on them, and when the ice melts, that is the source of the water that feeds the Nile. And he goes on to say, but that's crazy. That can't be right, because the further south you go, the warmer it gets. And everybody knows that. No idea that the further south you go, past the equatorial zone, it again gets cooler as you go towards the South Pole. But that was something that was told to him. He wrote it down nonetheless. But anyway, that's kind of fascinating. There are scientific answers to this, and you can find them for yourself. But also, you don't have to find them for yourself. You can just go to the experts who already went through that process of unlearning all their misconceptions, of learning what the scientific body of knowledge is and how we make sense of it, and what the theories are, the overarching theories and frameworks and models that govern this, right? And you can say, oh, but what if it's all in fun, right? What's the harm? What's the harm of believing in the flat earth? What's the harm of believing that the moon landing was a hoax? What's the harm of not taking vaccines because you think they cause autism? Or a few kids get a few more cavities because they want to have natural, unfluoridated drinking water? Or not wearing a mask because of COVID? And then you say, oh, right, these are the consequences, right? You can see that actually in countries all over the world, enormous numbers of people have died because we didn't adhere to the recommended practices that science says we should have done, right? Science tells us, oh, we should be wearing a mask to not only reduce the spread of droplets and aerosols, but also to keep the germs of others out, and to reduce the distance that our germs travel when we sneeze, when we cough, when we speak, all of those things, right? That wearing a mask has many, many benefits, and not wearing a mask makes you a public health hazard. It presents a danger to the health and safety of others. Same thing with social distancing. Same things with if you have to gather with people, better to do it outdoors, better to do it distantly, better to do it for shorter periods of time. Should we be wearing IPPE? It seems to. They have new studies out, both in the Lancet, that show eye protection PPE in hospitals reduces the risk of infection and disease transmission, and also observational studies where they say, you know what? The highest, if you look at who's nearsighted versus not nearsighted, critical COVID patients, far lower incidence of nearsighted patients than you'd expect from the general population. And they speculate it's because a bunch of them wear glasses, which offer some protection, apparently. But for those of you worried or curious about it, by the way, face shields are okay in protecting others from your droplets, but offer the wearer no protection. So you're just as good for yourself at being unmasked as you are wearing a face shield. Second off, what about those masks with the vents on them, those little vents? Well, those are great at protecting the wearer from external particles, but they offer no protection to external people from the mask wearer themselves. The mask wearer may as well be unmasked as far as infecting others. So wear a mask, but wear a mask that's either a cotton cloth mask or some facial covering that will reduce the spread of your own droplets, and that will keep droplets from entering you. And also don't touch the outside of your mask while you're wearing it, because that's where the germs accumulate. Keep washing your hands, remain socially distant, don't gather in indoor spaces, don't remain in indoor spaces for long periods of time, don't go to bars or restaurants. It shouldn't be that hard, because science has taught us what we should be doing. And of course, wash and sanitize your hands. But this is something that's ethical to do. This is something that's, you know, that's the humanitarian thing to do. These are states that allow conscientious objections, non-medical exemptions to vaccines. And you can see in that dark red, that's where the vaccine opt-out rate is the highest. These are where the outbreaks occur. Clark County in Washington, the first county north of Portland, Oregon, if you go over the Columbia River into Clark County, they had the highest vaccine opt-out rate in the country, where about 1/3 of children were unvaccinated against measles and various other diseases. And that's where the largest measles outbreak in the United States this century has occurred. So there are real world consequences to this. And of course, if you look at climate change, carbon emissions has just exploded. In that upper graph, carbon's emissions are that black line. And you can see that we are emitting over 10 billion tons of CO2 every year as humanity. And this number continues to rise. And you might look at that and say, oh, but the human population's going up too, and that's what's happening. And I will say, no. Look at the lower graph, where it's carbon emissions per capita, and you can see it's continuing to rise. In 1968, we crossed that threshold where every human on Earth was emitting an average of 1 ton of carbon emissions per person per year. And that number has continued to rise for the latest year in which we have data. So what should we do about all of this, right? I told you not to do your own research, not to rely on your own research. What should we be doing instead? The first thing we should be doing, the thing we should be overwhelmingly valuing, is listening to the consensus of experts. I know this feels hard to find when you hear that we're living in the era of fake news, but it's not that hard to find. If you want to listen to the consensus of experts, all you have to do is pick maybe 10 or 15 random professionals in a scientific field, random expert professionals. Ask them the same questions. When 13 or 14 of them all give you the same answer, that's the consensus. That's it. That's what you do. It just requires a little bit of quality journalism. None of person A says this, person B says this, we inform, you decide. No, that's not adequately informing people. That's presenting a false dichotomy or a false equivalence between non-equivalent perspectives. We place a lot of value on memorizing facts, right? You'll see headlines come out like, oh no, I can't believe that 1 out of every 4 Americans think that the sun revolves around the earth and not the other way around. Oh no, I can't believe that people can't find Kazakhstan or Europe or Florida on a map. Like, I'm not worried about that. I don't care what facts you have memorized. I care that when you need information, that you can either find it or you can go to someone who can reliably tell you where to find it. We should focus on knowing what humans know and how we know it. We should focus on finding who accurately represents what we know and how we know it to the world. And that's who we should be listening to. We should be listening to the people who are humble, who are honest about what we don't yet know. I think that Dr. Fauci has been a model for this throughout the pandemic, particularly over the last 3 or 4 months. And finally, we should develop an awareness of and an appreciation for what science is, what science does, and how listening to what science has uncovered about the world benefits us all. Being aware of the benefits of science, what it gives to us, the body of knowledge it teaches us, that is a huge undervalued part of scientific literacy. As a society, if we are aware of what the enterprise of science is and we appreciate the value that it brings to society, I think that will help us create finally a scientific America and a scientific information-based world that we would all benefit from living in. For humans, right, we are living in tumultuous time. Our present and our future is at stake. Can we embrace science? Can we embrace justice? Can we embrace humanity for everyone? Can we make decisions that are in the public interest? Because that's in our own best interest too. What's best for everyone as a group is also good for the individual. And finally, for science, the entire universe is at stake. Do we value understanding the smallest scales, the largest scales, and everything in between? These are things we can investigate, we can learn about, and we can comprehend. But we have to value it. We have to value actual knowledge more than our preferred conclusions masquerading as science. So here's the takeaway message that I want you all to have. I want you to take away the message that science is real. Science is this process, this self-correcting process that occurs because you have a large number of smart people who worked hard to gain this legitimate expertise to make these contributions towards understanding the universe. And it's this full body of knowledge viewed through that scientific lens that allows us to have this framework for how we make sense of the universe. That is what we call the scientific consensus. That's how we currently make sense of the universe more successfully than any other way. It's the pinnacle of human achievement. Everything that we have achieved in modern society is based in some way on a scientific consensus. Scientifically well-informed public policy is not only recommended, but it's necessary to provide our society with the best public health and public safety policies. And when we're healthier and safer overall, that benefits society as a whole and everyone in it. In fact, I would go even farther to say science is mandatory for a prosperous, civilized society. For those of you who don't know if you agree with that or not, look up Trofim Lysenko. Look up what happened with the North Korea famine when they didn't listen to agricultural practices and clear-cut the trees that prevented the water table from flooding, and they flooded out all their farmland, leading to famine. And finally, with respect to the title about the terrifying consequences of doing your own research, I'll say you can, of course, do your own research. You can. But when people say, do your own research, they're not advocating for you to go become an expert and make an independent contribution to this field once you've learned about the existing scientific consensus. That is not what they are advocating for. They are advocating that their lack of expertise is just as good at evaluating the evidence they've encountered as the actual experts are at evaluating the full suite of evidence that's out there. And that is nothing of the sort of doing your own research. So thank you for your time, and I'll turn it back over to our organizer and the Ethical Humanist Society, where we'll get some great questions coming up in just a little bit.
Thanks so much for your talk. That was really interesting, and I look forward to the questions and your answers. You can put questions that you have in the YouTube chat. We're going to have now a brief interlude for just time for regrouping and thinking about your questions. And as I like to say, questions and in question marks. which is how I know they're not just opinions with periods or exclamation points. The Ethical Society survives on contributions by people who value programs like this. So we, in this virtual moment, need to do our collection virtually. You can donate a variety of ways. ethicalhumanistsociety.org/donate, or with Zelle to donate@ethicalhuman.org. These addresses will be on the little thing across the bottom of the picture here. These contributions show how meaningful the Sunday programs are and allow us to continue to provide knowledgeable, engaging speakers. We suggest a donation of $5, but any amount that you can donate is greatly appreciated. And we like to express our gratitude to everybody who sustains the society with their donations of time and money. I'm going to stop talking for a minute. We'll have some music. We'd love for you guys to think about making a donation, and we'll come back after the music for your questions. Thanks. Welcome back. And as I said, we'll take questions through the YouTube comment box. I have several already. And so I'm just going to get started, and we'll see how many we get through. So the first question, how would a layman know that, for example, Dr. Oz is not an appropriate expert?
Oh, boy. Okay. So Dr. Oz is an interesting case because on the one hand, Dr. Oz is actually a respected cardiologist and a world-class heart surgeon. Interestingly enough, so is his father, Dr. Oz. If you wanted to know that Dr. Oz is not an appropriate expert, there are all sorts of fact check sites you can use. You can look at quackwatch.org. You can look at Science-Based Medicine. You can look at what other scientists who work in the field say about Dr. Oz's claims. You can attempt to do that fact checking yourself. But one of the big things that actually had a big impact on me was I read an interview a few years ago with Dr. Oz's father, the surgeon, about Dr. Oz, the TV personality. And he talked about how he, was just so chagrined at this, at basically the fact that Dr. Oz was selling his soul and selling out the health and wellness of everyone else to make money, and to make his own fame and personality grow. The way I'd say you do it, though, the best way to do it is to find experts in the fields of health and medicine, to ask them about who's a reliable source, what are they reliable about, right? Sanjay Gupta is also not an appropriate expert on a wide variety of matters. He has advocated against a large number of things where the scientific consensus is very clear. He fell victim to what I would call societal reefer madness for many, many years before changing his mind to a less extreme version of reefer madness. I would say if you want to know whether Dr. Oz is an appropriate expert or not, you need to look at the right sites, and the right sites are going to be people who are less famous, right? There's this whole network of disinformation about about from the wellness industry, and I know because I wrote a piece that this talk grew out of, about you must not do your own research when you come to science when it comes to science. And Joe Mercola, who is, the basically the internet version of Dr. Oz, in terms of, I have this supplement empire that I do, it's worth at least hundreds of millions of dollars. And I run this, and I'm more popular than WebMD, and I'm going to sell you a bunch of stuff. He put out a hit piece on me, and I received a large number of internet death threats, which was a lot of fun, I guess. Although it's never fun when you have to alert the sheriff of your county, like, hey, if you get a call for a SWAT team to come to my address, please don't send them, because there are some wild people out there. And I'll just say that that's how you do it. That's how you fact check someone like Dr. Oz, is you find the legitimate experts who analyze the claims of Dr. Oz and take them apart. But also have friends, or find friends, seek sources of information that will subject someone's claims to an appropriate scientific scrutiny. If you only have people who are contrarians or presenting contrarian viewpoints, you're going to echo chamber yourself. So try and find out who are the scientific experts that I can trust.
Okay, next question. We've got several. We'll see how we do with them. What are the boundaries? Can you summarize the boundaries of consensus of climate change? What are the most interesting, active, open climate change questions at this point?
What I'm going to do, I'm going to post a link to an article I wrote about that 3 years ago, because that's not my area of expertise, but I did go and look this up, because the biggest uncertainties are with the modeling of certain feedback effects, right? So we know in general a lot of things that are going to happen, but the biggest uncertainties are with feedbacks from atmospheric modeling, are feedbacks from, what are, we know the impacts on global scales, but we haven't been very effective with the models on uncertainties as far as the impact on human society and ecosystems go. So that's a place where the uncertainties thrive. But the number one uncertainty that we have is in ice sheet modeling. Ice sheet modeling is the current biggest uncertainty that we have. But as far as temperature rise, sea level rise, ocean warming, acidification, atmospheric changes, we've actually gotten very good at modeling that, and in particular on the interplay between water vapor and global climate.
So next question is to think a little bit about how much should we be concerned about who sponsors research? For example, medical studies sponsored by pharmaceutical companies, climate studies sponsored by big oil companies, and so on. How much does that affect how I should interpret or understand the conclusions of studies?
So some of that is going to be dependent on the industry you're in. In the pharmaceutical industry, what that money determines is generally what questions get examined, What are we looking at? What are we studying? What are we choosing to study? That's what that money really determines. It doesn't really determine what the outcome of the research is. The outcome of the research is something that, look, we have ethical scientists whose work gets reviewed, it gets looked for fraud, it gets looked for all of this. And most of the research that comes out holds up. It's scientifically valid. It can be replicated. It's done in a controlled clinical setting, and it's performed by scientists who are following the appropriate methods for their field. So I wouldn't necessarily question the veracity of those results, but I would say it is biased as far as what are we actually investigating here? What are we looking at? What are we choosing to study? That's where the biggest bias is, not in the conclusions, but in the questions we're asking. That's something that's extremely biased by funding.
How do we distinguish between experts who have a contrarian view that's provocative and pushes the horizon, and those that are just provocative and kind of being counterproductive by saying, no, I disagree? How do you distinguish those two? And the example here is Freeman Dyson on climate change.
I mean, so first off, you have to ask, why would Freeman Dyson be talking about climate change, right? Freeman Dyson is definitely not an expert in the field of climate change and didn't become an expert in the field of climate change. You can always ask those questions, but the only reason that we would give a statement like that some weight is because Freeman Dyson is a famous person in one field, and he's speaking out of his area of expertise, delivering a message that's going to really resonate with a certain segment of the general public in another field. We don't do that to people. You don't come to me and say, hey, Ethan, you're an expert on astrophysics. What do you think about, I don't know, fluoridated drinking water, right? You wouldn't trust me if I was just giving you my opinion. You would only trust me if I said, well, I went and I talked to all of these experts and I synthesized and aggregated this information, and here's what I learned. You can always ask questions, right? Temple Grandin asked questions about vaccines and autism. Freeman Dyson asked questions about climate change, right? Lots of people can do this, Lots of people just ask questions about vaccines and autism. Personally, I don't care, but I also don't think that's news. The fact that that gets reported as news and that gets reported as like, oh, maybe what we know about these things are all wrong. Maybe what we know is like, no, like, let's not get into solipsism and let's not get into listening to non-experts opine outside of their area of expertise. Let's listen to the consensus of experts, because those specific questions that Freeman Dyson raised, those are all zombie questions. Those are not questions those are questions that already have answers that are part of the scientific consensus and did when they were asked. And that's, again, that should be a journalist's job, that you don't present like, well, A says this and B says that, and what if B is right? No. A says this, B says that. We asked 15 experts. All 15 experts agree with A and say that B is just bringing up this discredited argument. And here's where that comes from. And here's what the actual answer is. We don't have that kind of responsible reporting as the default anymore. But I would encourage you, if you want to get the accurate answer, that's what you should be looking for.
There's several more questions. I'm not sure we're going to get to them all, but I'm going to go kind of vary in a different place here altogether. I never know if I should push back when a guy helps me move a couch and tells me that oil of oregano knocks out COVID-19. Any guidance on how hard to push on unscientific thinking in personal everyday life?
I had a similar thing. I was helping a friend who has a bunch of hay bales on his property, load his hay bales. And one of the younger people who was helping turned out to be a flat earther. And, I'm an astrophysicist, and my friend did not know his friend was a flat earther. And so when he said that to me, I started asking him questions like, well, if that were true, how would you test that? Right. And I started trying to get him to talk about what sort of evidence he would need or we would need to collect to know whether this idea was true or not. Right. And then I could start talking to him about, well, here's the evidence we actually do have, right? Here are the tests we have performed. What answers would you expect if it was this way versus what answers would you expect if it was this other way? And are you interested in learning what those answers are? And I can tell you what they are, but also you can look them up for yourself. And here's where you could find it. So there is unscientific thinking. And so you can ask those same questions for oil of oregano and COVID-19 and see what answers you get. You don't necessarily need to convince someone that they're thinking along conspiratorial lines. What you need to do, I think, is get them thinking critically and asking the right questions that if they go and find the answers to, they will uncover whether this is legitimate or not.
Back on that, just because I'm intrigued by that. 2 minutes ago, we heard that the issue about the oil companies and pharma is what questions even get studied. Don't I respond to you by saying, yeah, no one's going to make money off of the oregano thing, so no one's studying it. That the fact that no one's done the study that I want doesn't prove that my hypothesis is wrong, right?
Well, it's true that doesn't, right? And we have this saying in science that an absence of evidence does not indicate evidence of absence.
Right.
So you're right. There's not a large study on this happening. So what you can say is, if you think this is the case, that's what you want to ask is, what tests would you perform? What experiment would you design? How would you go about discerning right from wrong? Because if someone has a wild idea like that, right? If someone has a hypothesis like that or the skeleton of an idea, there's nothing wrong with saying, like, I have this idea that might be a thing, but what would it take to demonstrate that this is a real effect? What would it take to demonstrate that this has the desired effect? Because they can say, oh, this hasn't been done yet, and that's fine. But that also means, well, what evidence do we have that suggests this should be done? Because if that's not extraordinarily compelling evidence, right, then there's no reason to go ahead and do this, right? So you can have an idea, and I can't rule it out, but unless you show me evidence why I would think this is the case, and scientifically would, not like, well, I feel like it should in my gut, then that's I think the evidence you'd want to get to.
Okay, how would you suggest applying what you're saying to non-scientific areas such as history and current events, which are purposefully filled with erroneous information and fake news?
There was a great interview that was just published in Science magazine, I think this past week, with Dr. Fauci, where he talked about that, where he talked about, like, okay, like, you're telling me from the top, like, this is what should be going on, right? This is what we should be doing. But what's actually happening? So he was like, so I talked to people in the trenches. I talked to hospital administrators. I talked to frontline doctors. I talked to the people who, what are you actually seeing? What's actually going on the street? And that's where I get my information from. So you can say, like, okay, I want to know what's true and what's not. So who am I asking? What information am I collecting? What am I basing my information on, right? There is erroneous information. There is fake news. The important thing, just like you would go and ask experts, who are the experts on the front line? They're the people who collect the statistics for the hospitals. They're the people who tell you what they're seeing in their emergency rooms. That's actual journalism. So what I'm saying is, in non-scientific areas, you have to do that same level of fact checking and information gathering about what's actually out there. That's applying what I'm saying to non-scientific areas. Is you actually have to go out and say, like, Is Portland burning? Well, maybe I should go and look at Portland, Oregon, and ask all the people who live in Portland about what's actually going on. I should look at what's happening where, who's bringing the violence, where are things on fire, where is tear gas happening? And you learn like, oh, all of it is confined to this one little area, and this is what's causing the violence, and this is who's bringing it. And surprise, surprise, that's how you'll cut through whatever a narrative is and actually find the truth.
So this is going to be our last question. We're run out of time. So this last question is, many people conflate belief in experts' opinions with the argument from authority fallacy. Do you have a recommended explanation to clarify the difference?
Yeah, the difference is an argument from authority says, I'm the authority, you should listen to me because I'm the authority. Belief in experts' opinions are, you should listen to me and I can explain to you in gory detail, in as gory a detail as you like, why you should listen to this information that I'm telling you. And that information that I tell you is something you can go out and fact check by asking all the other experts in the field. And if you don't know who they are, as an expert myself, I can give you a list of experts that you can go and ask that are independent, that are not related to me, that are not, co-authors of mine, that are just respected individuals in the field from around the world, and you can ask them to confirm this for you. If someone is a legitimate expert, they will be willing to do that. In fact, most of us will be eager to do that because we don't want you to just take our word for it. Right? We're more than happy to provide you with the information that exists, that we have, and we're happy to share it with you. But if you want additional information, if you want additional sources, we're more than happy to provide that. We can provide you links to studies. We can provide you basically with the full suite of evidence. You don't need the full suite of evidence, but the reason is not, well, you should believe me because I'm Freeman Dyson, or you should believe me because I'm a doctor, or you should believe me because I'm an astrophysicist. You should believe me because I'm being honest with you about what the data, the analysis, the information, all of it combined, because of the conclusions it leads us to.
So I hear in that the subject of the sentence is this idea and not me. And I think that would be the difference.
I agree with that completely. If you took me personally out of this whole presentation and you just had the words that I said, hopefully it would be just as true and just as believable. It's not because, oh, well, Ethan's here and he's given it and I trust him.
Right.
I hope you do trust me, but whether you do or not, you can go out and find how much of this information is true independently. And I hope you do. If you're so inclined, go ask experts. Go ask experts to evaluate these claims. And if I'm wrong about anything, by the way, let me know and I won't make that mistake a second time.
So I wanted to thank you so much for spending your morning with us. We just have a few minutes. Normally in person, we'd all be clapping, but we can't do that here. So just hear a bunch of clapping, okay? But don't get a big head. Again, I hope you'll join us in the coffee hour. And thanks for joining us this morning.